Hi everybody. Today what I'd like to focus on is something that we all encounter as academic writers at one time or another, the thesis statement. My guess is you first heard this phrase when you were a little kid, maybe even in middle school, but I find that it's one of the hardest things to do well, and it really is important to do well because if you think about it, it is the building block of any argumentative style research-based paper. Everything comes back to your thesis statement. So what I'd like to do today is to give you guys some ideas on how to go about crafting those thesis statements in a way that makes them stronger and fresher and more interesting. So let's get rolling. Tip number one is you always want to make sure your thesis statement is debatable. It means if your thesis statement's presented to a stranger or a group of people, they should be able to come up with differing opinions on it. If your thesis statement is something that's generally agreed upon or accepted as fact, you don't really have any work to do as a writer because everybody already accepts it, right? It's true, I more or less agree with that, and no matter what you have in the body of your work, there's nothing I'm going to learn here, there's nothing that's going to surprise me or get me to see this issue differently. And as I put up here, your paper will fizzle because you have nothing to prove or teach to your readers. So here's an example of a non-debatable thesis, and I know this is very kind of simplified, oversimplified, but that's on purpose. I want you to just see the differences here. But this student writer came up with one: pollution is bad for the environment. Okay, it's an argument, right? But if you presented that to a group of people, nobody in the crowd is going to disagree. So then again, you don't have any work to do. You don't have anything to prove or to show your readers. So let's take a look at how that thesis statement could be revamped to make it debatable and more interesting. So you see there are a few different ways. There's one: at least 25% of the federal budget should be spent on helping businesses upgrade to clean technologies and researching renewable energy sources. Whoa, way different than that first one. Remember, pollution was bad for the environment, that was it. Now we have some things we can push back against as readers, and more importantly, the writer now has work to do. She has to roll up her sleeves and really show through her persuasive writing skills and research that all of what she just presented to us is the correct direction to go. So in other words, 25% of the federal budget, you might think more, you might think less, but she has to show us why that's the sweet spot, why that's the magic number. She also shows us where that money should be put. Clean technologies, researching renewable energy sources. You might disagree. You might think that money should be put here and here instead, but now she has work to do as a writer to show us that nope, clean technologies, renewable energy sources, this is the way we have to go, and her research can back it up, her persuasive writing skills will back that up, and the more important thing is she has work to do throughout her paper. She's going to teach us something and trying to get us to see the issue from her perspective. So you always want to make sure that those thesis statements are debatable and people can push back. That's a good sign. That is a good sign. Tip number two, I find that a lot of student writers, at least in the beginning stages of their papers, often present thesis statements that are very broad. And I want to emphasize it's important to narrow it down. This will make your life easier as a researcher, as a writer, but it will also make your paper stronger because now you're not trying to prove this and this and this and this all in an 8-page, 9-page paper, whatever the scope of that paper is, the page limit. But you're showing your reader that you have limits placed on and you really, really are laser focused on what you're trying to show them. You don't want to overwhelm your reader, nor do you want to overwhelm yourself as a researcher, as a writer. So let's take a look in the middle here of the slide. An example of a thesis statement that is too broad. The student writer comes up with, drug use is detrimental to society. It's an argument, right? It is a thesis statement, but we have a lot of questions as readers. This is very broad at this point, and there are a lot of undefined terms that make it broad. So my first question would be, well, what drugs are you talking about, right? What class of drugs? What do you mean by that word detrimental? What does that mean? And then who in society are these drugs negatively impacting? So there are a lot of big questions here that the writer hasn't answered in that thesis statement, and right now it's just too broad to build a paper around, and her paper will suffer as a result if that's the jumping off point. So let's take a look at the revised, narrowed down version. And it goes from drug use is bad or detrimental to the environment to illegal drug use is detrimental because it encourages gang violence. Well, now we can zoom out as readers and we know what types of drugs she means. We also have a clear sense of what she means by detrimental, talking about gang violence, and who in society these drugs are harming, who she's going to focus on in her paper, gang members. So a lot of answered questions there. We just narrowed it down, and the paper's going to become more focused, and because of that, it's going to be much stronger. She knows exactly where she needs to head as a researcher and what to focus on as she begins drafting, but now the readers know what she's trying to prove earlier on in her work and get a clear sense of what the paper really is about. And it's not this huge, broad statement anymore. So narrow it down. Always make sure those thesis statements are, one, debatable, but also want to make sure that they're narrowed down and really focused, laser focused. Okay, tip number 3, is it fresh? We have so many debates in our society, and we hear so much of the same when it comes to some of these debate topics, where we know what that side thinks and we know what that side thinks, and it's kind of just repeated over and over again. And I want to make clear that just because your thesis statement is debatable and narrow, it doesn't mean you're ready to rock and roll. So what we put up here is it needs to pass the so what test. So in other words, a group of strangers you send your thesis statement to, and they look at it and they just shrug. Well, they're not interested, right? They've heard that argument a million times. They know what that paper is probably going to be and what it's going to say without even reading it. You really haven't done your work as a reader. So we need to make sure that the thesis statement is fresh, that it's offering a new perspective on the issue. And I put down here on the bottom of this slide to try it out. Shop your thesis statement around, bounce it off people in your reading circle, whether those are your student peers or readers in your personal family that can take a look, and gauge their reaction. If you're getting a bunch of shoulder shrugging, it's probably time to revise and rethink that argument so that it's something more interesting and fresher. This is an important one. Tip number 4, don't forget those qualifiers. We use qualifiers in everyday speech all the time. Maybe you don't know them as qualifiers, but I guarantee you use them. They're just simple words like typically, generally, usually, in some cases. And why these are so good to use in an argumentative style paper when you're crafting your thesis statement is it helps limit the scope of your claim, and it makes you come across as a much more reasonable and focused writer, and your credibility will go up in the reader's eyes. You're not trying to prove that this statement is true 100% of the time, no ifs, ands, or buts, but now you're using that qualifier to show that there are limits placed on your argument. So let's take a look at an example here in the middle of this slide. A thesis statement without a qualifier. Taxes on imports are too high. Well, that makes it seem like that's the case 100% of the time across the board, no ifs, ands, or buts, and we know that it can't be that simple, right? We know that that's not the case. So just this one word, look at with the qualifier, oftentimes, taxes on imports are too high. It totally changes the tone. That slight modification now ensures that there are some holes in the argument that the writer is going to accept, and that most arguments have holes, and they aren't true 100% of the time. And it also helps that you're putting the point across to your reader that you see there are multiple perspectives. Yours might not be the only one that is valid and true 100% of the time. So experiment using those qualifiers. They're just one word or sometimes just a phrase, like in some cases. Usually, generally, typically, just one word can really radically change the tone and the scope of your thesis statement and make it much stronger and make the way that you appear on the page to readers come across as a much more credible writer. So that's all I have for just kind of a run through thesis statements and what to keep in mind. And as always, you can watch this video as many times as you need, and feel free to reach out with any questions.